All right. Hey, thanks for coming to church on a beautiful day. I always pray for rain on Sundays, I got to be honest. But I'm glad you came today. We're glad. As we jump back into our series, let me just ask you this question. Have you ever had what you would call a mountaintop experience in your life? A spiritual experience where you had an encounter with God that brought you so close to Jesus that it changed your life and left you with a profound sense of awe and wonder, right? Maybe it was at a camp or a retreat or taking a hike in the wilderness or standing at the edge of the ocean or listening to a worship song or sitting in church. It could be any of those things where all of a sudden we realize that we're so close to Jesus. We're closer than we've ever been or closer than we remember being. And it changes our lives. When that happens, man, we want to hang on to those experiences. We want those experiences to last as long as they can. I have had several of those in my life. When I was a kid, every summer I would go to Silver Birch Ranch in the north woods of Wisconsin. Shout out to Tim's homeland. And every summer I'd have a sense of, in fact, I think my calling to ministry started at that camp because every summer I'd have this closeness with Jesus, and I'd tell my friends about my relationship with Jesus, and I realized I was way more excited about it than they were. I've had missions trip experiences. When I was 19, I went on a trip to Haiti, and that was a profound experience in my life. I've got pictures of the next couple here. In 1997, I was a youth pastor. I took a bunch of high school students. You can't tell the high school students are and where Kara and I are in that picture. We were like in our 20s, just a few minutes older than the kids we took on the trip. But that was a great experience to go to Guatemala with them. It's different when you're leading, but still a profound experience. Just a few years ago, Kara and I went to Kyrgyzstan. I had to look it up on the map to see where Kyrgyzstan was before we went. I had no idea, but we had a great experience there. And later that same year, I went to Russia, to Moscow, to train pastors and church leaders from all over Russia and all over the former Soviet Union, which was a humbling experience because it cost those pastors and those leaders everything to live their lives for God in that part of the world. We think it cost us something here, and it does. It costs us a little bit, but nothing like it cost them in that part of the world. The thing about mountaintop experiences, when we have them, they don't last very long. And with time, they tend to fade. And if you know Oswald Chambers, his devotional, My Utmost for His Highest, a lot of you have heard of that. I used to read that a lot in my 20s. Not so much anymore because I found Oswald to be a little harsh. But he talks a lot, maybe a little too truthful for me, I don't know. But he talks a lot in there about the mountaintop experience and how many Christians go in pursuit of the mountaintop experience as their primary experience as a follower of Jesus. And so he says we chase the high, and we try to hang on to that experience as long as we can. But then he stresses, and he's right about this, that the mountaintop experience is rare, and it's meant to be rare. It's not something that we're supposed to hang on to because life is not meant to be lived on the mountaintop. Life is meant to be lived in the valley of our everyday experience. It's in the valley where our lives make the most difference. It's where they're supposed to make the most difference. And what we experience on the mountaintops should be a catalyst. What we experience there should inspire us to take what we've experienced there and the love of Jesus and share it with other people who are just drudging through their lives in the valley of everyday life. All right? So the term mountaintop experience comes from this passage that Kari read for us this morning, Matthew 17. And as we move past where Tim took us last week, and Tim gave us a great message last Sunday, as we go from there to the next miracle in Matthew, there's a lot of things that take place between these two miracles. The first thing is there's the feeding of the 4,000. Oxel, where are you? Yeah, Oxel loves the story of the feeding of the 5,000, but later on, Jesus speaks to another crowd of 4,000 men, probably 15, 20,000 people, as Oxel is telling me. And Jesus had compassion on them, and so he miraculously feeds them with a little bit of food. That happened. Then in Matthew 16, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And only Peter responded, "You're the Messiah." you're the Son of the living God. And at the end of Matthew 16, Jesus tells his disciples that in a few days when we go to Jerusalem, I'm going to die. And the disciples don't know what to do with this. These poor guys, they had just, with Peter's help, recognized that Jesus is the Messiah. And now he tells them that when they go to Jerusalem, he's going to die. And the Messiah wasn't supposed to die, not in any sense of the idea that the disciples had ever been taught about the Messiah was he supposed to die. The Messiah is supposed to come into the world, conquer the government, overthrow the Romans, and establish God's kingdom on earth forever. He's supposed to be a conquering Messiah, not a suffering Messiah. So the disciples don't know what to do with all this. To add to their problems, then in Matthew 16:28, Jesus says, I tell you the truth, some standing here right now will not die before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. The disciples' heads are spinning at this point, right? First, Peter recognized Jesus as the Messiah. Then he tells them he's going to die. And now he says, some of you are going to see the Messiah coming in his kingdom before you die. They're like, what the heck is he talking about? What's going to happen here? How are any of us going to live to see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom if Jesus is going to die in a few days when we go to Jerusalem? What is he talking about? And that's where we jump into Matthew 17. So here, Jesus takes his three favorites, and Jesus had favorites, sorry. Peter, James, and John. He takes them up what is probably Mount Hermon he takes them up that mountain to pray. And he did. He had a pattern of taking Peter, James. He doesn't have favorites really, but he did have a pattern of taking Peter, James, and John with him when things got really serious. So when, if we look back, when in the story, Jairus, when his daughter died, that moved Jesus significantly. He took Peter, James, and John to the house of Jairus and healed his daughter. Not only healed her, but resurrected her from the dead. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John, and he says, hey, will you guys pray with me, stay and watch for me? And then Jesus goes and throws himself at the mercy of his Father and begs for another way. And he's so stressed about what's happening, and so it's so intense that the blood vessels in his head burst as though he's sweating drops of blood. He was in intense pain. And Jesus wanted these guys around him when that happened. As they climb Mount Hermon here, Jesus is aware. He knows that just in a few days, they're going to be in Jerusalem, and his life is going to be turned upside down. He's going to sacrifice his life on the cross. When they get there, first he's going to be betrayed by Judas. All of his friends are going to abandon him. Peter's going to deny that he even knows Jesus 3 times. Then he's going to be arrested, mercilessly beaten, and ultimately nailed to a cross. Can you imagine functioning with all that information in your head, with all that knowledge on your heart? I mean, Jesus made it to the Garden of Gethsemane before he starts to break down. I would have never made it that far, right? I would have not been able to have a conversation with anyone as long as I knew that was happening. So with all this on his heart, it's no wonder that he wants to take his 3 closest friends and get away and seek after the heart of his Abba Father, to seek the will of God. He's going up that mountain to pray to make sure that what he's doing is the right thing. If you're saying I'm going to Jerusalem to die, you better make sure that's really what God wants you to do. And that's what Jesus is trying to figure out on this mountain. He's seeking assurance from God that going to Jerusalem and going through all that betrayal and heartache and death is really God's plan. He needs to know that without a doubt. So I'm going to say something obvious here to you. Jesus is a great example for us when it comes to our relationship with Jesus or with God. Look what he does. In the words of, where's David? In the words of David, obviously he is, right? So when Jesus feels vulnerable and uncertain, he seeks clarity and reassurance from his Abba Father. So can we when we feel vulnerable and uncertain. Jesus never made a move of any consequence without consulting God first, and neither should we. And Jesus always surrendered to God's will for his life, even when it required sacrifice from him, and so should we. And then also the good news at the end is that Jesus received the strength and clarity and insight he needed to do what God asked him to do, and so will we. when we go to God. But if we choose not to surrender, if we choose not to follow Jesus' example and seek God out this way, then God has a way of bringing us back to the same experience over and over again, the same choice over and over again until we do surrender. And God doesn't do that to us because he's mean and angry and likes to mess with us. God does that with us because he loves us more than we know. He loves us more than we possibly know. He does that to us because he absolutely wants our best. In fact, he wants our best sometimes more than we want our best. And he's not okay with letting us settle for anything less than his very best for our life. So, what is it that God's asking of you in these days? What's he asking you to do? Maybe he's asking you to let go of something so that you can hold on to his hand, right? Maybe it's that. Maybe he's asking you to trust that his way really is better than your way. Maybe he's asking you to trust him in a new way or for the first time with your finances. Maybe he's asking you to give your whole life all the time as a follower of Jesus instead of some of your life part of the time. Maybe he's asking you to make things right in your relationships. Is there somebody that you know that's harboring ill will towards you? Are you harboring ill will towards somebody else? Maybe somebody in this room that you need to have a conversation with later. Whatever it is, the best thing we can do is surrender ourselves to God's will, and we will experience the very best for our lives. If we don't, he really will. He really does bring us back to the same choice over and over again until we do. So we might as well not fight him on it. The Gospel of Luke tells the same story, and Luke says this in verses 29 and 30. As Jesus was praying, the appearance of his face was transformed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared and began talking with Jesus. They were glorious to see. I feel like I need to say obviously to that last sentence too. Of course they were. Several cool things happen here on this mountaintop experience. First, Jesus is transformed or transfigured in a way that reveals his glory. A lot of time when you see glory in the Bible, somebody else is reflecting God's glory. Jesus isn't reflecting anybody else's glory. A metamorphosis has taken place in Jesus. Like when a caterpillar goes into the cocoon and comes out a butterfly, Jesus is fully God and fully human, and he is allowing the fullness of his divinity to radiate through him. He's revealing who he really is here. And that's cool. The second very cool thing that happened is that Moses and Elijah show up. These two of the most significant figures in the Old Testament. And Moses represents the Old Testament law. Elijah represents Old Testament prophecy and prophets. And because they're there with Jesus, what God's saying is that all the Old Testament law, all the Old Testament prophecy, everything the Old Testament says is fulfilled in who Jesus is. And then the fact that they're there together, Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, they'd all led people out of various types of bondage. Moses led the Israelites famously out of slavery in Egypt. Elijah freed God's people from bondage to the gods of Asherah and Baal and from worshiping idols. And Jesus, obviously, by sacrificing his life on the cross, he frees you and I from slavery to sin and death. Moses and Elijah, they both had life-changing mountaintop experiences in their lives. God took Moses to the top of Mount Sinai, revealed the 10 commandments to him, and as Moses brought them down, he's reflecting the glory of God. Again, that's a reflection of glory. He's reflecting the glory that he got from God, where Jesus was emanating his own glory. Elijah actually had two life-changing mountaintop experiences in his life. In 1 Kings, he gets all the prophets of Baal and Asherah up to the top of Mount Carmel. You take a message, I'll get back to them later. He takes all the prophets of Baal and Asherah up to the top of Mount Carmel, and they have this showdown. And the showdown is that whoever God rains down fire from heaven first is the real God. And so if you know the story, Elijah says, you guys go first. And so the prophets of Baal and Asherah cry out to their gods. They scream all day. Elijah mocks them and says, maybe you have to scream louder. Maybe he's going to the bathroom. And so they scream louder, and they cut themselves, and the blood's gushing out. And there's no response, nothing. And then Elijah gets up and he says, oh God, prove today that you're the real God, the God of heaven and earth. And fire from heaven comes flying down and burns up the altar and licks up all the water that Elijah had poured all over it just to make sure nobody cheated. That was a powerful mountaintop experience, but it led to his second mountaintop experience. After that, the queen, Jezebel, she's a bad queen. That's why we don't name our kids Jezebel anymore. She says, Elijah, I hate you. If I'm alive by this time tomorrow and if you're alive by this time tomorrow, may the gods kill me because I didn't take your life. You would think Elijah would say, have at it, babe. God's on my side. You just rained down fire from heaven. Why do I have to worry about you? But that's not what he did. You know what he did? He ran for his life. He ran into the desert. He was terrified and he was suicidal. He tells God, I'm no better than anybody that came before me. God, take my life. And God leads him out into the wilderness, provides for his needs, and then takes him to Mount Horeb. And on the top of Mount Horeb, God has this amazing thing take place. This mighty wind blows through the mountain, and Elijah realizes that God's not in the wind. And then a mighty fire goes flying through the mountain, and Elijah realizes that God wasn't in the fire. And then an earthquake shakes the mountain, and Elijah realizes God wasn't in that either. And then he hears a gentle whisper through a thin silence. He hears a still small voice, and he realizes that that's God, and he steps out. And God begins to redeem his life from that point. Powerful mountaintop experience. Some theologians think that Elijah and Moses represent the categories of people who belong to the kingdom of heaven. Moses represents people who have died or will die before Jesus comes back. And Elijah represents people who don't ever die and are there when Jesus returns. Because Elijah never died. 2 Kings 2 tells us what happens. Elijah is walking with his protege, Elisha, thank you. And as they're walking, a chariot of fire comes flying through between them, led by horses of fire. And just after that, as they're standing opposite of each other with this chariot in between them, Elijah is taken up into heaven by a whirlwind and never experiences death. So he represents people that'll be alive when Jesus returns. As cool as all of that is, and as true as all of that may be, the real reason that Moses and Elijah are on the mountain with Jesus is to encourage him to go through with what he has to go through when he gets to Jerusalem. It says in Luke 9:31, Moses and Elijah were speaking about his exodus from this world, which was about to be fulfilled in Jerusalem. William Barclay says, when these two great figures met with Jesus, it meant that the greatest of the lawgivers and the greatest of the prophets said to him, go on. It meant that they saw in Jesus the consummation of all that they had dreamed of in the past. It meant that they saw in him all that history had longed for and hoped for and looked forward to. It was as if at that moment, Jesus was assured that he was on the right way because all history had been leading up to the cross. And the fact that Peter, James, and John are there witnessing this fulfill what Jesus had told them just 6 days earlier when he said, I tell you the truth, some standing here right now will not die before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. They got a glimpse of it. They got a taste of the coming kingdom when they saw Jesus with Moses and Elijah, but that wasn't all that they got. They nearly missed the whole thing, these guys. They were sleeping. Verse 32 says, Peter and the others had fallen asleep. When they woke up, they saw Jesus' glory and the other two men standing with him. But this is not the only time these guys would fall asleep on Jesus. When he takes them to the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, guys, my soul is crushed to the point of death. Please stay here and pray with me. Pray for me. Watch for me. What did they do? They fell asleep. They couldn't keep their eyes open. And that's what happens to us when we get fearful and overwhelmed and depressed. It's not that they didn't care. It was that they cared so much that they couldn't stay awake. You know, when you get overwhelmed by fear and depression, sometimes we just fall asleep because it helps us deal with it. It helps us escape from the pain and reality for just a little bit. It may not be the healthiest thing to do all the time, but it helps us. It can help us. But here, these guys are sleeping not because of those reasons. They're sleeping because Jesus took them on an overnight, and they probably hadn't woken up yet. And they wake up just in time. In the English Standard Version, Luke 9:32 says this, "But when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him." It wasn't until they were fully awake, fully present, that they understood what was that they began to understand what was going on and who they were with. So that just leads to the question, are we fully awake? Are we fully awake to our relationship with Jesus? Are we fully awake to all that he has done for us, to all that he is, to all that he offers us? Yeah, I'll try. It's possibly to be spiritually asleep and not even know about it. That's especially true for any of us who haven't given our lives to Jesus. We may think we know all that we need to know about church, God, and the Bible to make our decisions, but have we really examined who God is, what he's done for us, who Jesus is, the sacrifice that he's made for us, and what the Bible really says? Some of our closest friends, we talk to them about the fact that they've never done that. We've got in our friend group some friends they just don't want anything to do with church, though some of them have come to branches, which is very cool. Because when they were younger, they had horrible experiences in the church where they were judged and made to feel like outcasts who didn't belong. So it's very difficult for them not to paint all Christians and all churches with the same brush. And I don't blame them, right? I understand, right? Some of us have had really bad experiences in the church. It's hard for us not to do that. I get it. We have other friends in that same group that have never really considered who Jesus is. I think I've told you this at least once. We were sitting in their living room not long ago talking about faith and trying to get them to come to Alpha. And they realized, as strong as their opinions are about faith and Christians, they have never really examined the evidence. And I would hate for them never to do that. So I invite them to Alpha every stinking week. And as much as I love those guys, the truth is they're not fully awake spiritually anyway. Not yet. We can't be fully awake if we prefer to take the easiest route in life. I have this conversation with my girls all the time. Don't just do the easiest thing. What's the good of doing the easiest? Do the best thing, even if it's hard. And they roll their eyes. I'm like, whatever, do it, And then Kara and I try to model that to the best that we can, but with mixed results because we're flawed and human, right? But life has a way of waking us up spiritually. Love. When we fall in love, we are awakened to life, man. When we fall in love, all music is awesome. The sun shines brighter. The sky is clearer. The birds singing is more beautiful. Like everything's awesome when we fall in love. We're fully awake, right, to the things around us. Everything is beautiful. But pain and sorrow and grief also have a way of awakening us to what's real in life. There's a story of the English composer, Sir Edward Elgar. He once had a phenom singer, what's the word I'm looking for, audition for him. And she was great. She was the next great thing, according to everybody that knew her. And she gave a great performance. It was technically perfect, but it lacked expression and it lacked soul. And so Elgar didn't give her the part. And when somebody said, she's like the next best thing, why did you not give her the part? And he said, well, when something breaks her heart, she'll be ready for this part. And as harsh as that is, that's true. When we all experience heartache in our lives, and we are all greater for having experienced heartache, at least we have the opportunity to be greater for having our hearts broken. If we can avoid becoming cynical and bitter about having our hearts broken, because remember, the same sun that melts wax also hardens clay, then we will be better people. We will be stronger people. We all experience heartache and pain in our lives, and we can either try to go through that alone, we can try to avoid its effect on us to the best of our abilities, or we can take that pain to the God who concerns himself with the details of our life, allow him to redeem it, and then experience how he redeems it and how he uses it for our best. And if we let God do that, then we will live a more abundant life. We'll be wiser, we'll be deeper, we'll be more compassionate, we'll have more patience. all of those things will be true. And some of you who've gone through pain and come out the other side know very well that that's the case. As much as we try to avoid it, if we let God access our pain, he can do great things with it. So Luke 9:33 says, as Moses and Elijah were starting to leave, Peter, not even knowing what he was saying, blurted out, Master, it's wonderful for us to be here. Let's make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. So here's Peter just being Peter, right? He's doing his thing. Peter had a bias for action, and I normally love that about Peter, but acting without thinking or without seeking to understand usually gets us into trouble, as it did with Peter over and over again. This wasn't a moment for action or even for words. This is a moment for silence and reverence and for taking it all in and considering what it meant. Sometimes if we busy ourselves because we don't know what else to do, we can miss the great opportunity that's right in front of us. And when that happens, we miss out on what God intends us to experience. We miss out on the great lessons of life even. Peter would have been a lot better if he would have adhered to Psalm 46. Just be still and realize you're in the presence of God. So Peter, though, he's like so many of us, or I don't know if it's so many of us are like Peter, he wanted that mountaintop experience to last. So not only does he try to prolong it, he tries to memorialize it by building these tabernacles, because he's not in a hurry at all to get back to the valley of everyday life, because life in the valley for Peter meant that Jesus is going to Jerusalem and would die, and Peter's outcome would be very uncertain. He's in no hurry to get back there, and the same is true for us. Life can be just as confusing and unsettling for us in the valley as it was for Peter. Remember, the mountaintop experience isn't meant to be prolonged. It's meant to be a catalyst that we use to benefit us and benefit others in the valley of everyday life. So as Peter's sharing his thoughts about setting up tabernacles and prolonging this thing, he's interrupted by God. Oops, Peter. Matthew 17:5. But even as he spoke, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my dearly loved son who brings me great joy. Listen to him." And the disciples were terrified and fell face down on the ground. Mount Hermon is 9,500 feet. It's over 12,000 feet above sea level. So they probably weren't on the very top of the mountain. They're somewhere up on the mountain. And if you've lived in Seattle for any number of months or years, you've heard it say that Mount Rainier creates its own weather. We've got a picture. So there's these lenticular clouds that show up and are beautiful. They shroud the mountain. That's kind of what was happening here, but it wasn't weather. It was the glory of God. And throughout the Old Testament, a cloud represented God's presence and God's glory. It represented the Shekinah glory of God, the visible glory of God. The people of Israel were led by God's presence, a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night for 40 years. And that's what's here. It's God's presence. So God here bails Peter out of another more embarrassing situation by interrupting him. And it's clear that God has sent Moses and Elijah to encourage Jesus, but then God himself shows up and says, I'm affirming who Jesus is. I'm affirming what he's doing and what he's done and what he's going to do. And I'm telling you guys to listen to him and do what he says. You're much better off when you do. And that's great wisdom for us too. What is it that Jesus is saying to us in these days? What is it that we need to hear from him? If we're not sure how God speaks to us, he tends to speak to us. He certainly speaks to us through the Bible. He also speaks to us through the circumstances of our life, and he speaks to us through other people. Usually all three, not necessarily just one of those things unless it's the Bible. But what is it that we need to hear from Jesus these days? Maybe it's this. Maybe it's, I love you just as you are and not as you think you should be. Maybe you need to hear him say, I love you just as you are and not as you think anybody else thinks you should be. Maybe you need to hear Jesus say, hey, I have forgiven you. And maybe it's time to forgive yourself and lay that burden down, lay that shame and guilt down that you've been carrying for so long. It's not yours anymore. I've taken it from you. It's time to let it go. Maybe you need to hear him say, I know what you're going through. You don't think I'm here and you don't think I care, but I do. I know exactly what you're going through, and I am in it with you, and I am for you. You don't need to be afraid because you are not alone. How many of us need to hear that? Some of us need to hear, hey, it's time to stop running and surrender to me. Or it's time to realize that my ways are higher than your ways, and you're not going to always know everything, so just trust me and surrender. Jesus then, in Matthew 17, verse 7, Jesus came over and touched the disciples. Get up, he said, don't be afraid. And when they looked up, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus. So as they head back down the mountain, Jesus tells them, like, I would have failed Jesus' request here. He says, don't tell anybody what you've seen. How do you not tell people what you just saw? Including the other, 9 disciples. Don't tell those guys. They already know you're my favorites. They don't like you anyway. Don't tell them. So Jesus, he didn't want the crowd at the bottom of the mountain to hear what had happened, because if they heard that God showed up with Moses and Elijah, they would have been tempted to take Jesus and make him their king by force, which would have totally wrecked the plan for him to give his life as a sacrifice in Jerusalem. So on the way down the mountain, the disciples are still confused, and they ask a great question, Matthew 17:10. Why do teachers of religious law insist that Elijah must return before the Messiah comes? This is a great question, because the very last verses in the Old Testament, the parting words of the Old Testament are this in Malachi 4, 5, and 6. Look, I am sending you the prophet Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord arrives. His preaching will turn the hearts of fathers to their children and the hearts of children to their fathers. So they ask this because they wonder how Jesus can be the Messiah and fulfill the duties of the Messiah if Elijah hasn't come first, the way that the Old Testament prophet said that he would. And Jesus says, hey, John the Baptist fulfilled that prophecy in Malachi. It was John the Baptist who was the forerunner of the Messiah. And then Jesus says, and the religious leaders and the government didn't want to hear from John, so they killed him, just like they don't want to hear from me, and they're going to kill me when we get to Jerusalem. I say this every week when I speak. Jesus lived the life we couldn't possibly live, and he died the death we should have died, so that you and I are free from paying the penalty for our guilt, our brokenness, and our sin. Jesus did that so that he could provide spiritual freedom for every one of us in this room. Galatians 1:4 says, Jesus gave his life for our sins, just as God our Father planned, in order to rescue us from this evil world in which we live. I read that and I think, man, that was written 2,000 years ago. The world was a much better place than it is now, and yet they called it evil. So on the mountaintop, what Jesus does here in this mountaintop experience is that he proved to his disciples, and hopefully to us, that surrender always leads to glory. Surrender always leads to glory. When we surrender to God's will for our life, God always uses it for his glory, always, and for our best. And Peter, James, and John desperately needed to embrace that truth. Each one of them surrendered it took them a little bit, but each one of them surrendered their lives absolutely and completely to Jesus. Was there a bird that just came in here? Yeah, I heard it too. So that was like a literal bird, right? Oh, a bird. That was a literal bird. So these guys, they lived out their life sharing the hope that they had in Jesus in the valley of their everyday existence. And they needed to hang on to what they experienced on the mountaintop, because they would all give their lives in one way or another for the cause of Christ. James was the first disciple to die when King Herod Agrippa had him killed in Acts 12. John, not only did he suffer the loss of his brother James, but he was exiled on the island of Patmos, where he suffered and lived alone in isolation. He wrote the book of Revelation there, but that was the greatest thing he did. It was a brutal thing for him to live out his life there. And Peter gave his life for the cause of Christ. History tells us that Peter was also crucified, but that Peter asked to be crucified upside down because he wasn't worthy to be crucified the way that Jesus had been crucified. So they all came to realize, they all learned something profound that caused them, on that mountaintop, that caused them to live out their lives in devotion to Jesus in the valley of their everyday life. The glory that Jesus revealed, by the way, on Mount Hermon isn't something that you and I have to wait until we're dead to experience. We can experience a taste of that glory ourselves right now. Look at 2 Corinthians 3:18. It says, so all of us who have had that veil removed, meaning now we're in a relationship with Jesus, we can see and reflect the glory of the Lord. And the Lord, who is Spirit, makes us more and more like him as we're changed into his glorious image. That can be happening and is happening in our lives right now as we surrender to Jesus. There isn't a person in here who doesn't want to know what God's will is for our lives. And the best way to know what that will is to do what Jesus modeled for us. That's to go to God, get away, don't make a move without going to God first and surrendering our lives completely and consistently to him. When we do that, he begins to reveal his purpose in profound ways and in clear ways. But ultimately, we discover God's best and his purpose for our lives when we surrender. And surrender always leads us to glory. Surrender always leads us to the glory of God. And the glory of God means that the best thing is happening for us too. So as we come to communion, maybe you take communion today and maybe you don't. Let's make coming to communion today, not just going through the motions, not just doing what everybody else is doing. Let's come to communion if we're willing to be willing to surrender to Jesus, to say, what Peter, James, and John all came to realize is that nothing was worth living their life wasn't worth living if it wasn't lived and surrendered to Jesus. So coming to communion today says, God, I surrender myself to you fully and completely. I want to align myself with your will. I want to make sure that the way that I'm living is aligned with your will. And so I surrender. And if you're not ready to do that, that's okay. Just don't, skip communion today. Take it next week. No big deal. Let's pray. Father, thank you for this passage. Thank you for the ways that you reveal yourself in your word. Thank you for how you reveal yourself to the disciples. Thank you for teaching them lessons that we can learn from them so we don't have to learn them straight ourselves, though we often do. God, I pray that as we take away what we've considered here, that you would bring us to the point where we are courageous enough to trust you, to surrender all that we are for all that you have. God, as we come to communion, it is a willingness, it is a prayer saying, God, we surrender to your way. Your ways are higher, your ways are better. That's the way we want. That's the way we want to go. We pray in Jesus' name.